Today, I want to talk about the concept of relevance in education. You hear the term a lot: culturally relevant education, or just relevance in general. Like, well, the education should be relevant to their daily lives, like it's some kind of pragmatic thing. And I want to bust that wide open. I want to question whether that is true, that students, K 12, even beyond, even in college, need the curriculum to be relevant to them, need to be able to make choices they think are relevant. So not even just that the adults should decide that they're relevant to the children's lives, but that the students should choose, and the students should direct, and the students should have a say in what they think is relevant to their lives. And if curriculum doesn't fit that description, if they don't think it's relevant, it shouldn't be taught. That we should be evaluating what we teach to students based on whether they think it's relevant, or some adult somewhere can convincingly say that it is relevant to them. Why don't we question this? Why do we accept it? Why do we sit back and say, oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah, totally. They should think it's relevant. Really? When was the last time you tried to get your kid to do a chore around the house and they didn't want to do it? And they said no, and they pushed back and so forth. And you might have said, you're going to need how to do this someday. This is relevant to your life for you to have these life skills of doing laundry, picking up, using the vacuum, mowing the lawn, cooking a meal, etc. And your student or your child, for that matter, fired back, I'll just do DoorDash. I'll hire a maid. I'm going to make money. I'm just going to do this. Or some other argument about how it wasn't really relevant, or they didn't care, or I'll deal with it then. That I don't care. That doesn't change the fact that I don't want to do it now, and I'm not going to do it, etc. So forth. Teenagers, for example. Or a kid said, I don't see why I need to know that. I don't see why I need to use that. And you've tried to persuade them, and they have said, no, I don't see it, I don't get it, etc. And you found yourself talking to the equivalent of a brick wall. So now that you've got that picture in your mind of the kid who, for lack of a better term, doesn't know what's good for them, right? Because they'll argue with you till the cows come home. Not all of them. Obviously, there's some kids who are like, sure, mom, sure, dad, I'll go do it. And you didn't even need to use the relevance argument. I'm talking about the ones who are like, not feeling it. Don't want to do it. Don't think it's relevant. Or they use the argument that's not relevant. And there you are saying, but I know it is, and I can't convince you, right? Or they want to borrow money for something, and you're trying to explain to them why that might not be a good idea, and you're trying to contextualize that for their life down the road, and they're not listening to you. Or don't use drugs. Don't do what your friends are doing. Any lesson you've tried to teach your own children about what they should or shouldn't do based on how it might impact their future, and you were left talking to somebody who just stared blankly at you or argued with you, and you knew, because of your superior life experience, that you were correct and they were not. And yet they looked back at you as if you were brain damaged and or no one they needed to listen to anyway. So why would it make any sense at all to arrange the school curriculum around what those same people who need to be cajoled and threatened and bribed and baited and every other thing into doing their laundry or picking up their room or any other thing that is a relevant life skill, saving money, is the best person to judge what's relevant for them to learn in school? What about if it's a specific topic like history or civics or English? How in the world do these people who have not had life experience, years and years of life experience under their belt and so forth, how is it that we would defer to them about what's relevant for them to learn in their daily lives? Why would they know? They don't know what they don't know. They literally don't know what they don't know, and they only half know what they're supposed to know. So it seems kind of nonsensical, right? To, try to figure out what's relevant to their lives based on what they tell you. They don't know. Relevance becomes sort of a code word for what do they like? What will entertain them? What will they engage with? To focus on relevance is to make the student in your class a consumer of a product known as education, where the goal is for them to be happy in the moment. Is that likely to be relevant to their life long term? Relevance to their life right now is I want to be free to do what I want and not have to clean the house, because right now my life is about doing what I want when I want. Relevance isn't someday I'm going to be on my own and I'm going to need to do this. And, they have no perception of that. That's why they have parents and adults who are still in charge of their lives. That's why they're not adults. That's why they cannot legally make lots of decisions, because they don't do it well. We know that. Their brains are not fully developed. And even when they are, as I'm sure you can remember from when you were 25 or 26, you still probably made some questionable choices, and so do they. So will they. You don't know what you don't know. I didn't know at 25 what I knew at 35. I didn't know at 25 what I knew at 30. And I didn't know at 35 what I knew at 40, and so on. If you had said to me, design your own curriculum in college around what will be relevant to your life, I wouldn't have had the first clue. If you said design it around what's relevant to your life today, well, my goodness. What's relevant to my life today is getting really good grades and getting out of here and getting into grad school. So I'm going to take easy step. I want the work to be easy, because my reality right now is to do as well as I can right now. Nothing to do with the future. And the younger you are, the more in the moment you live. So do you see why it would be absolutely absurd to focus curriculum development on what's relevant to the child's life right now? I would even suggest that kids don't know what's relevant to their life right now if you're talking about teaching them how to cope emotionally with things happening in their community or in their homes, whatever. And you know why? Because even when you grow up in a super dysfunctional family, because I did, so I can speak to this, you don't know the whole story. All you know is about the chaos. All you know is things aren't the way you wish they were. Things feel uncomfortable. You don't feel completely safe, etc. But quantifying that and trying to figure out what you might need to learn around that, very hard to do, because you don't really know the size and shape of the problem to even explain it to someone else. And for any teacher or curriculum developer to try to figure out what an entire class of 25 or 30 kids needs to know when you have no idea how many kids are in that situation and how dramatically different their life experiences are, like, how would you know what relevance even looks like? You wouldn't. And if you were to teach all of them as if they're in such a dysfunctional, traumatic environment, and many of them are not, now you're exposing them to things that they don't really need to be exposed to that might actually traumatize them or confuse them or make them unusually fearful. I've seen kids who have come out on the other side of programs where they talk a lot about what it's like to live in a divorced household and all this stress and all this trauma, and their parents aren't divorced, and they begin to obsess over every little argument their parents have. Are my parents going to get divorced becomes their biggest fear. It's the boogeyman that hides under their bed. And tragically, sometimes they can start involving themselves in their parents' arguments, trying to prevent that occurrence, and things get worse. Or conversely, maybe they foolishly, naively think they would like their parents to get divorced because they prefer mom and they prefer dad right now. That's their relevant story. And they think this will add color and interest to their lives. And they triangulate. And you might think, that sounds insane, but I've seen it. I've seen it happen. Kids are very suggestible and they're very emotion driven. And we live in a culture where being a victim of a certain kind or having certain kinds of trauma in your life is actually currency, social currency. So maybe focusing on all this relevance is teaching kids they need to find something to be relevant socially in their social group. And if there isn't anything, maybe they need to make something up. So be very careful when you use the word relevance. And finally, since a child doesn't know what's going to be relevant 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 50 years from now, whatever, in their own lives, why would you let them self-direct? And I'm going to get pushback from the homeschool community on this one. It's like, oh, self-directed learning is so great. Let's differentiate between self-pacing and self-directing. Self-pacing has its place. Absolutely. Arbitrarily pushing your kid to complete things in a certain time frame doesn't make a lot of sense, especially the younger they are. As they're starting to approach, the ages where they might be looking to apply to college, it might have some relevance. But even then, Thomas Sowell didn't go to college until he was in his mid-20s because he did a stint in the Marines. I think he did just fine. So there's really not a big rush. That's one of the beauties of homeschooling. So self-pacing, highly recommend it. Highly recommend it. But I certainly wouldn't compromise the integrity of the subject matter or the rigor of the program by allowing a student to self-direct, as in choose what they feel like they want to learn. The only thing I would do is say that's fine if you're supplementing. If you're saying, what is the kid's passion project? What would they like to learn more about than they ordinarily would in a regular curriculum? So for example, if you have a very artistic child and ordinarily they might take an art class, maybe they take 2 or 3 instead, or maybe they load up on art one semester and then they do other things different. That's very different than self-directing, and I'm going to spend all of my time studying art and maybe we don't ever get to grammar. And maybe we don't really focus a whole lot on math, and then lo and behold, 2 years go by and I haven't taken any math. And yet I know people who do that. I know a fair number of people who do that. I say, we're letting the child self-direct and guide toward their own learning. They don't know what they don't know. They don't know what's out there to learn. And they don't have the first clue why it would be relevant to anything else. And if you live in this magical fairyland where you think that as they learn the things that they do like, they'll come upon the realization that they need to learn this other stuff, they might, but it might be 5 years from now when it's actually a little late to start learning that subject, because they will never be able to rise to a level in that subject that they otherwise would have had they started earlier. They just don't have enough time. And here's what's even more important. There are these windows of time in your brain when you're like a little sponge, where you can absorb rote learning and lots of data very easily and then apply it to something else. We know this is true of learning languages. We know it's true of learning math. It's also true of learning any subject where there's a large amount of data you just need to memorize or learn. And that could include specialized vocabularies. That could include math-related things like science. If the child doesn't gravitate towards science, doesn't learn any science, doesn't do any science, and then suddenly they read something in a book or they did something else that was more relevant to them, and they think, oh my gosh, I want to learn more about this, and they start diving into it, but guess what? They're 13 or they're 14. And learning it all and then being able to make it through chemistry and physics and so forth in time to possibly pursue a career in college in the natural sciences is going to be extra difficult. Not saying they can't do it. They absolutely could do it. Anything's possible. I'm saying, is it really responsible on your part to allow them to not touch science for 4 or 5 years? Especially if you think, well, then they'll discover it and they'll like it and whatever. It is our job as adults to expose our children to that which they would not otherwise find on their own in a timely manner, so they can decide for themselves after that how much they want to specialize. But even if they decide they don't want to specialize, having a broad base of knowledge in a lot of different subjects is much better in the long run if you start earlier. So that means you can't allow the child to just self-direct what they're going to learn or decide what's relevant to them right now. Because what's relevant to them right now is always going to fall short of what, is relevant in life, because they don't know what life looks like. They don't have the first clue. They're new here. I say it all the time in the channel. They're new here. Hold on to that thought. They're not miniature adults. And if you're wondering where I got this idea, the idea to make this video, I was listening to the book by Jason Riley about Thomas Sowell called Maverick, about his life, mostly about his intellectual life. And he was very much against relevance in education. And he saw it taking over at the higher ed level, where students were pushing back on some of the courses they were asked to take because they felt they were not relevant. It's not relevant to my life. Why do I need to learn this? I don't need this for my course of study. But it really came down to, in his estimation, that they just didn't like the course, didn't enjoy it. It wasn't in their major. and they weren't good at it. And so therefore they said it wasn't relevant to them. They didn't see how it was relevant. Why would I use this? And the story goes that this happened to him when he was at Harvard and he had to take French. And he was furious. Why is this relevant to me? I don't need French. I don't want to learn French. I took foreign language. I don't want to deal with this. But he had to. He wouldn't have been able to graduate. So he took it. He didn't fully realize the relevance of that experience for 20 more years. But it was, because he decided he wanted to do his doctoral dissertation about a specific French economist. And the only way to read the 5th edition of this man's writings was to read them in French. It was the only way. He couldn't have read them. And his dissertation, which was largely based on the writings of that 5th edition, couldn't have been done. So he was pretty glad he had that French. Now, your child or you might have had different experiences, but the point stands. A child does not know what is or will be relevant in the future in terms of their learning. They certainly don't know what is relevant to the subject matter area. So when you take English literature, for example, in the English language, I don't mean English from England, and people say, well, the readings need to be relevant to their life. What they're really saying is, we want the kid to read books that mirror their personal experience. So you'll see a lot of, if you have a lot of Black students in the class, a lot of literature written by Black authors. If you're in an urban setting, then the books will be about people in an urban setting. And that's what they're calling relevance. Is it though? Is that what makes something relevant? Or is that just what makes something relatable? There's a big difference between relatable and relevant. And just because something's relatable doesn't make it relevant. There are lots of books out there that I could relate to. So what? I don't want to read my own story over and over and over. Do you? Like, that gets kind of boring. I live it. I'm not really interested in reading other people going through it again and again and again. There's a limited amount of mileage you can get out of validation literature. And that's assuming it actually is. So you have teachers making a lot of assumptions based purely on the color of somebody's skin or, their ethnicity or their socioeconomic level, whatever. They could be absolutely wrong. I grew up Jewish, but if you had given me a lot of books about certain kinds of Jewish life, I might not have related at all because I didn't have a typical Jewish upbringing. We didn't keep kosher. We didn't observe the Sabbath with regularity. We half the time didn't go to services on high holidays. But we did celebrate Passover and Hanukkah, and we also celebrate Christmas. So we had this very bizarre understanding of our Jewishness. So if you'd put books in front of me that were all about, observant Jews, I wouldn't have related any more than if you put books in front of me about observant Christians. So you can't make those judgments. You just don't know. And likewise, I don't think I would have enjoyed English class very much. Worst case, I would have felt pandered to, and inappropriately so. Best case, I would have read some, stories, but they wouldn't have expanded my mind. They wouldn't have shown me anything about the world beyond the tip of my nose. So I'm very glad that everything I did read in middle school, high school, even college, was about people very different from me, living in times very different from my own, having experiences I can't even imagine in many cases. I feel like I learned a lot more, and ironically, a lot more about myself reading material that somebody would surely have said was not relevant to my life than I would have had I read a bunch of validation literature that I could relate to. So next time somebody says, this is culturally relevant, this is relevant, we want the kids to have relevance in their education, I want you to stop and ask them how they know it's relevant. How do you know it's relevant to their life? And if they say, well, because it's about the Black experience, or it's about LGBTQ people, then you can ask, are you assuming that all people with Black skin have the same experiences? That their lives mirror each other? Does your life mirror the life of every other person who looks like you? What about LGBT youth? Do all of their life experiences mirror each other? How do you know what the LGBTQ experience is? That acronym itself is smashing together wildly different life experiences. Many would argue those letters shouldn't even be in the same category. So I guess what I'm trying to do with this video is I'm trying to get you to question underlying assumptions that are made so often and with such prevalence that we never question them. Don't do that. Question them. How do you know it's relevant? Why does relevance matter? Don't you really mean relatable? What if you're wrong? What's the consequence if you're wrong? If you gear everything towards what they want to read right now, what they think is interesting today, are they actually learning? Are they growing? Or are you just placating and pleasing like they're consumers of a product you want them to buy? Why are you afraid to try to sell them on knowledge that they don't already have? Why are you afraid to try to broaden their minds about people they'll never meet, with whom they cannot relate? Are you saying there's no relevance to them learning about people they can't relate to? Why is that? And so on. We need to ask much better questions than we do. We need to ask questions, period. We take things for granted we shouldn't take for granted. So next time you hear somebody talk about that, ask more questions. Thanks for watching. As always, if you like this content, please consider subscribing to the channel. Like, share, and comment on the video. And I'll see you in Locals, thereasonwelearn.locals.com. Have a great day.